In the quiet hills of western Massachusetts stands a place built to care for those who once served their country. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Leeds, Massachusetts, was where aging soldiers came to heal, to convalesce, and sometimes simply to be looked after in their final years. It was a place of routine, the hum of monitors, the shuffle of shift changes, the small comforts of nurses who knew their patients by name. But between 1995 and 1996, something inside that hospital went catastrophically wrong. Veterans who had survived war began dying suddenly, their hearts stopping without warning, and for a time, no one understood why. This is the case of Kristen Gilbert, a nurse who was convicted of murder, and of the colleagues whose suspicions finally broke the pattern. To understand how it happened, we begin with the woman at the center of it. She was born Kristen Heather Strickland on November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, intelligent and capable. She pursued nursing, earning her degree from Greenfield Community College in 1988. That same year, in 1988, she married Glenn Gilbert, taking the name that would later appear in headlines across the country. On March 6, 1989, she began working at the VA Medical Center in Leeds. She was assigned to Ward C, a medical and surgical ward, where she cared for veterans of America's wars, men who had served in conflicts stretching back to the Second World War. For a time, Kristen Gilbert was regarded as a skilled nurse. Colleagues would later recall that she seemed to have a particular knack for emergencies. When a patient's heart stopped, a cardiac arrest, known in hospital shorthand as a code, she was often first on the scene, calm and quick to respond. In a hospital, that kind of composure under pressure is prized. What no one initially registered was how often those emergencies happened when she was on duty, and how frequently the patients at the center of them did not survive. Cardiac arrest, on its own, is not unusual in a hospital caring for elderly and ill veterans. Men in their 60s, their late 30s, their 40s, with underlying conditions, their hearts can fail. Each individual death, viewed in isolation, could be explained. That is precisely what made the pattern so difficult to see. A death here, a death there, spread across weeks and months, each one signed off, each one mourned quietly, and then absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of the ward. It takes a particular kind of attention, and a particular kind of courage, to step back and ask whether the individual tragedies add up to something that should not be happening at all. Let us name the men whose deaths would eventually anchor the case, because they were not statistics. They were veterans, each with a life behind him. Stanley Jagodowski was 66 years old, an Army veteran. He died on August 21, 1995. Henry Houdin was 35, an Air Force veteran, one of the younger men on the ward. He died on December 8, 1995. Kenneth Cutting was 41, an Army veteran. He died on February 2, 1996. And Edward Squira, a World War II Army veteran, 69 years old, died on February 15, 1996. 4 men. 4 families told that their loved one's heart had simply given out. In the months and years that followed, investigators and prosecutors would come to see those deaths very differently. The turning point did not come from a detective or a coroner. It came from within the ward itself. In 1996, 3 nurses who worked alongside Kristen Gilbert reported their concern about something they had begun to notice. There had been an increase in cardiac arrest deaths, and, just as troubling, there had been a decrease in the hospital's supply of epinephrine. Epinephrine, adrenaline, is a powerful stimulant. in the right dose, administered by trained hands during a code, it can restart a failing heart. But epinephrine is not a benign substance. In the wrong dose, given to the wrong patient at the wrong time, that same stimulant can send a healthy heart into a fatal arrhythmia. It can cause the very cardiac arrests it is meant to treat. That was the quiet, devastating logic behind the nurse's concern. The medication that kept vanishing from the supply was also a substance capable of causing sudden cardiac death. And the surge in deadly cardiac emergencies seemed to track with a specific presence on the ward. Reporting a colleague is never a small thing. These were nurses raising an alarm about someone they worked beside, someone trusted with the lives of vulnerable patients. It would have been far easier to say nothing, to assume the deaths were simply the sad arithmetic of a ward full of sick, elderly men. Instead, they spoke up. That decision set the entire investigation in motion. Once the concern was raised, the questions multiplied. Investigators and hospital officials began to look at the deaths not one at a time, but together. They examined the shift records, who was working when the codes were called, who was present when hearts stopped, who was on duty during the sudden clusters of emergencies. They looked at the accounting for the epinephrine, trying to reconcile what had been ordered and stocked against what could be documented as legitimately used. This is the painstaking, unglamorous core of a medical homicide investigation. Reconciling schedules, drug logs, medical records, and the timing of deaths. Searching for a correlation that ordinary bad luck could not explain. As the scrutiny intensified inside the hospital, Kristen Gilbert's own conduct became part of the story. On September 26, 1996, a bomb threat was made to the VA Medical Center in Leeds. The threat disrupted the facility and diverted resources and attention. This was not an incidental footnote. Gilbert would be convicted in April 1998 of that bomb threat, a conviction that stands entirely apart from the deaths, and one that placed her squarely at odds with the institution now examining the pattern of fatalities on her ward. The bomb threat brought federal attention and underscored that this was no longer a matter of internal hospital review alone. Because the deaths occurred at a Veterans Affairs facility, federal property, caring for those who had served in the federal armed forces, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. That is why the ultimate prosecution would unfold, not in a state courthouse, but in federal court, and why the potential penalties would eventually include questions that reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But long before any trial, the investigators faced a formidable challenge. Proving a medical murder is among the hardest tasks in criminal law. There is rarely a weapon in the conventional sense. The setting is a place where death is expected, where powerful drugs are administered every day, where the line between a life-saving intervention and a lethal one can be a matter of dose and timing. Prosecutors would have to build their case from patterns, from records, from the science of how these particular men died, and from the accounts of those who worked alongside the accused. On July 11, 1996, Kristen Gilbert was arrested. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, building a case around 4 deaths, and, ultimately, around allegations of attempted murder involving other veterans who survived, required medical experts, statistical analysis of the deaths and the shifts, and a careful reconstruction of what had happened to each man. Each of the 4 deaths had to be re-examined through the lens of a single, unsettling hypothesis, that these were not natural cardiac events at all, but the result of epinephrine deliberately introduced into patients who had no medical need for it. The legal process moved slowly, as complex federal cases do. Years passed between the arrest and the trial. Finally, the case went before a jury in Springfield, Massachusetts. The trial began on October 16, 2000, and it was a lengthy, demanding proceeding, stretching into the following year. Over months, the prosecution laid out the deaths of Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Houghton, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira, alongside the allegations concerning the veterans who survived. The jury heard the medical evidence, the accounts of the pattern on Ward C, and the story of the missing epinephrine. The trial continued through the winter and into the spring of 2001. The jury's task was immense. They were not asked to decide a single death, but multiple counts, each requiring them to weigh medical testimony and circumstantial evidence to a standard beyond reasonable doubt. Their deliberations reflected the weight of that responsibility. The jury deliberated for 83 hours across 12 days. 83 hours. 12 days. That is not the pace of a foregone conclusion. It is the mark of careful, deliberate people wrestling with the gravity of what was being asked of them, examining and re-examining the evidence for each individual count. On March 14, 2001, the jury returned its verdict. Kristen Gilbert was convicted of first-degree murder in 3 of the deaths, and of second-degree murder in the 4th. As CBS News reported in its account titled, "Killer Nurse Gets Life," she was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of 3 veterans, second-degree murder in a 4th death, and the attempted murder of 2 other veterans. Encyclopedia.com, in its account of the Kristen Gilbert trial of 2000 to 2001, recorded the verdict as guilty of 3 cases of first-degree murder and 1 case of second-degree murder, along with 2 counts of intent to murder. The distinction between the counts matters. First-degree murder reflects a finding of premeditation, a deliberate, considered act. That the jury reached that conclusion in 3 of the 4 deaths speaks to how they weighed the evidence of intent. Then came the question of punishment, and here the case carried a dimension that set it apart. Because this was a federal prosecution, the death penalty was on the table. After the guilty verdicts, the trial moved into a penalty phase, where the same jury was asked to decide whether Kristen Gilbert should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. On March 26, 2001, the jury made its recommendation: life imprisonment. The following day, on March 27, 2001, the judge formally imposed the sentence. Kristen Gilbert was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years. 4 life sentences, 1 for each of the 4 men whose deaths she was convicted of causing, stacked one after another with no prospect of release, and 20 years beyond that. The story did not entirely end at sentencing. Kristen Gilbert pursued a federal appeal seeking a new trial. But there was a crucial complication. A United States Supreme Court ruling had raised the possibility that if she won a retrial, she could once again face the death penalty, the very outcome the original jury had declined to impose. Faced with that risk, in July 2003, Gilbert dropped her federal appeal for a new trial. That decision is significant for understanding exactly where this case stands. Because she withdrew the appeal, her conviction was never vacated, never reversed, never overturned. There is no appeal currently pending. She was recorded as incarcerated, serving her sentence at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, in Fort Worth, Texas. No source indicates any exoneration or reversal. The conviction stands as it was rendered in that Springfield courtroom. It is worth pausing on what this case represents and on the people at its heart. Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Houghton, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira were veterans. They had worn the uniform of their country, Army, Air Force, one of them a survivor of the Second World War. They had come to a hospital built specifically to care for men like them, expecting to be safe. The betrayal at the core of this case is not only the taking of their lives, but the violation of the trust that a hospital and a nurse is supposed to embody. When a patient lies in a hospital bed, they are among the most vulnerable people in society. They depend completely on the honesty and skill of the people caring for them. That dependence is the foundation of all medicine. There is also a lesson in how the pattern was finally broken. It was not a security system or an administrator that first sounded the alarm. It was 3 nurses, colleagues on the same ward, who noticed that the deaths were rising and the epinephrine was disappearing, and who chose to report it despite the discomfort and the professional risk of accusing someone they worked beside. Their vigilance is a reminder that in medical settings, the people best positioned to detect that something is wrong are often those on the front lines, watching the daily rhythm, sensing when the ordinary has become the impossible. Cases like this one have influenced how hospitals track medication, monitor patterns of unexpected deaths, and take seriously the concerns raised by staff. The vanishing epinephrine in this case shows why controlled accounting of powerful drugs matters, not as bureaucratic box checking, but as a safeguard for lives. The case of Kristen Gilbert became one of the most studied examples of what can happen when someone entrusted with saving lives instead takes them, and of how difficult such crimes are to detect and prove. The 83 hours of deliberation, the medical experts, the reconstruction of each death, the years between arrest in 1996 and verdict in 2001, all of it underscores how much work it takes to hold someone accountable when the setting itself is one where death is expected and powerful medicine is always at hand. Today, the men remembered in this case, Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Houdon, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira, are what should remain at the center of the story. They served their country and came to a place meant to protect them. A jury of 12 people, after 83 hours of deliberation, found that they did not die of natural causes. Kristen Gilbert was convicted and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. She remains incarcerated. The conviction, never overturned, stands as the final word of the justice system on what happened on Ward C in Leeds, Massachusetts. And the courage of the colleagues who spoke up remains a quiet, enduring lesson that paying attention and refusing to look away can be the difference between a pattern that continues and one that is finally stopped.